the thing about this is that actually if there's anything I do say and you kind of want to interrupt or interject or whatever, do that. I mean, I like, to be more informal, and I hope there are other feedback forms. Oh, no, I just hate feedback forms. No, they're really annoying, and I went to a conference recently and I checked a pile of them, and somebody had written next door to mine name. They said if I only had an hour left to live in my life, I'd want to spend it listening to a speech by Simon Fanshawe. And I thought, hurrah, and I turned to the continuation page and they'd written, because it would seem like eternity. So I really hope you don't feel like that. I don't mind people looking at their watches while I'm speaking, but it annoys me to see them tapping them to see if they're still working. So I'm going to go through some thoughts, really. That's just me, just to tell you. Stonewall I will talk about because I was one of the original 6, and I stand before you as a man profoundly and depressingly disappointed and sad. Diversity by Design is our consultancy, and I'll talk a bit about that. The thing about putting HR Magazine's 4th most original thinker, that really annoys me. Look, it's very nice of them to say that I'm an original thinker, but 4th? You don't even get on the podium if you're 4th. You don't get a sweetie, a medal, nothing. And then there's going to be an absolute kind of plug for my book as we go through. Damien, 2 books that you read that you would recommend. I mean, how tactless was that? This is my book, ladies and gentlemen. This is the book you should spend your pocket money on, thank you very much. And I'm sure we can organise a discount, but anyway, it's available from all good bookstores and Amazon, I understand, at £14 a penny today, so there you go. Look, I want to try and go through some myths. I think that this whole discussion of diversity and inclusion, both outside our organisations and inside our organisations, is in some deep kind of crisis. Essentially, there's a crisis of dialogue. Essentially, we talk about having conversations, but the truth of it is, at the moment, they are mediated through single voices. They are constrained in far too many ways. They are surrounded by social exclusion. They are created in such a way that actually people are terrified of what they are going to say. 40% of people, a YouGov poll before Christmas last year, 40% of people are scared to express their opinions at work. Now, there are very good reasons why you might have rules about what you do and don't say at work. There are very good reasons why you might not want to bring political issues into work. I absolutely understand and accept that. But on the other hand, if you don't create situations where people aren't able to say what they think in one area, it spreads. And it spreads across that organisation so that actually it starts to create a culture in which people are nervous about saying what they say. So I want to explore some of that and think about the practical ways we might open up some of these things. And I've chosen to characterise it as the 5 dangerous myths. And you can see what they are there. But just to start with, really, that I'm picking up on something that was said before. It was a question about how you engage everybody. And I love the emphasis on the stories that all of you gave in the panel, the importance of storytelling. If you're going to engage people, as somebody said, diversity is not a minority sport. It's essentially not about who you are, it's what about you bring through who you are. Everybody has a story to tell in some way or other. And I want to explore that because the way I think that we engage everybody is that we set between ourselves the common purpose, and we then work out what our different contributions are to that common purpose and how we combine our differences in order to achieve it. The point about being at work is it does have a common purpose in your team, in your department, in your organisation. You're there for a purpose. You're not at the pub. You're there for a reason. And the reason is the common purpose. It's the goal. It's what you're trying to say. So whenever I talk about diversity, I always start by asking people, well, what are you trying to do? Because diversity then becomes a combination of difference. In other words, a talent strategy to achieve what it is you want to do. So it's a different place to start, but I think it's a key to engaging everybody in the process. That's merely restating it again. That's the problem with slides. There's something profoundly human at the base of this, though. It's not a profession. It's not a technology, it's not a technique, it's not a policy, it's not a process, diversity. It stems from that fundamental idea that we cannot see the world through anybody else's ideas. I mean, those of you who are in relationships, I mean, don't you wake up sometimes in the morning and you look at your partner and you think, I have no idea who you are? And then there are other mornings when you wake up and you think, oh, I know exactly who you are. You know? I just to illustrate this personally, is that my husband is he's Nigerian. He's a Nigerian. He's not a British Nigerian. He's a Nigerian. So he's Nigerian and I'm British, and so he's African and I'm European. So rather obviously he's black and I'm white. And he's religious. I'm not religious. In fact, he's a Muslim and I'm definitely not a Muslim. And in fact, he's 26 years younger than me. Whenever I tell people that set of facts, they always say the same thing, which is, how do you deal with the age gap? And the reason they say that is everything else just looks like too big. It's like all these huge headlines. But you know, our headlines are just written very large. They're just big headlines. But the truth of it is, any relationship with two people, those headlines are there. They're just written differently. And in the end, it's that journey to go on to try and understand the other person. And that's what diversity is about. It's the fact that we never will. That's where the joy comes. That's where the excitement comes. So it's a human thing to do, and it's profoundly human rather than a process or a policy. And I think we really need to try and get it back to that for the success of our organizations. Just a couple of distinctions here. Diversity, the whole notion stems from a kind of deficit idea, because it stems from trying to counter discrimination. And we know that there are deficits. I mean, there just are. So what we're doing here stems often from that idea of countering discriminations or increasing representation. My proposition to you is that that is absolutely fundamentally important to understand where those different groups of people are that we know experience that kind of discrimination. However, when we start to talk about what's the value or what's the power of the difference, the power of diversity, that's when you start to talk about the dividend. Now, I'm suggesting to you that these need separate focus. They are not the same thing. They are clearly related, but they are not the same thing. And one of the things is because the reason that they're not the same thing is that, and this was emphasized in the panel, was that actually we have to recognize two things, and I never know what order to put these four things in, but there is an important need to recognize group disadvantage. There are groups of people who experience disadvantage. I mean, there was a wonderful conference recently called, in 2020, called #BameOver, and what they were saying was, stop making us an acronym. They're saying, stop putting us into this group because we are diasporas and we come from Asia and South Asia and East Asia and Africa and so on and so forth. And then at the end they said, we all experience racism. We're different culturally, family-wise, parent-wise, everything-wise, but we experience one thing. So disadvantage we understand. You know, it's what I call the fist in the face moment. You know the fist in the face moment. It's the moment when actually you are disadvantaged because of that particular thing. But that doesn't define you. It may describe you sometimes, but it certainly doesn't define you. So we somehow have to work our way. So my framework for doing that is firstly talking about deficits and dividends. Secondly, thinking about group disadvantage against and then followed by individual talent. Individual voice, individual ambition. So that leads you to this idea of stories, which is it's not who you are, it's what you bring through who you are. I mean, in my case, there really is nothing interesting about being gay. In and of itself, it's just a thing. There's something interesting about growing up gay, because that puts you in a relationship to the world of a particular kind. Lots of people actually share that relationship. I think it's a kind of insider-outsider thing. I mean, look at class. I mean, you know, that's a fantastically important element of the way in which people grew up. If you grew up poor, it's a very different experience of growing up wealthy. You know, and I mean, people say to me, I'm very middle class, which always annoys me, actually, because I am upper middle class. But, you know, I'm a real posh boy, you know what I mean? But that doesn't mean to say that I don't understand all sorts of things about the world, you know? And that last thing, too, another distinction, which I think lies at the heart of some of our problems, is that there's a triumph of the subjective at the moment. There is this extraordinary idea that the phrase, I feel unsafe, is the same as I am unsafe. The subjective does not tell you about the world. The subjective tells you about a single view of the world. What we have to do in organisations is listen to and understand the subjective, but then we have to find group and collective solutions. And I'll explore that a little bit more as we go through. So first, a quick word on deficits. Now, I love this, if you Google Board of UK PLC, this was the first picture that comes up. And I love the fact, if you look at the left of the picture, at the back, sort of numbers 3 and 4 in, they're trying. They are trying, bless them. You know, there's the woman and I guess the Asian guy, I'm not sure. But that's the picture that comes up. Now, the thing about white blokes, there's nothing wrong with white blokes. Hello, here I am. There's nothing wrong with white blokes. It's the preponderance of white blokes. That's the problem. Now, people look at this picture too and they say, you don't know they're all the same. And I go, yeah, I know I don't know they're all the same. But part of the problem is that they have very similar experiences when they get to that stage in their career, and so that they tend to think in the same way. Now, of course, if you value the differences and really bring it out, they aren't the same. And the thing about deficits is that they are absolutely everywhere. I mean, we are excluding groups of people, and the data will tell you this. It's very easy to find it out. Do something very quickly for me. Just look at the person next door to you and look them in the eye and say to them with all sincerity, this is as far as you are going in your career. Go on, give it a go. You see? It always has exactly the same reaction. It's unbelievable, isn't it? I mean, no decent person could do that. So what we do is we laugh because we can't cope with the idea of it. The worst time I ever did it was there was a man and a woman who just happened to be sitting next door to each other in the front row, and they did that, and it turned out she was his PA. So that was a bit of a worry. But you know, that is what we're doing to groups of people in our organisations. We are literally saying to that's it, here's the ceiling, and on we go. So we have to recognise that the deficits are there. And I once counted, I just thought this was fun, I did it yesterday. I just counted, though, the top 300 roles in the FTSE 100, and there are more white men called John, David and Michael than there are women or people of colour in those roles. But the real question is, why does that happen? I don't think it's good enough, and the research doesn't suggest that it is right, that it's just racism or sexism in a kind of blanket sort of way. There will be people who are recruiting to those jobs who are, for one reason or another, prejudiced. Actually, what I think is much more likely, and the research tells us this, is that it's about what those people value in the people they're recruiting. Because what they start to value is people who've been on boards before, or people who've worked in CFO roles before, or whatever. So they're valuing experience, which actually ultimately is very similar to their own. So they'll say things like, well, we take the best person, for the person from the top of their role, or the top of their job, or whatever. Well, if they are at the top of an organisation, you think, well, they're the people for my board. Actually, and that organisation or that sector is very unbalanced in a particular way, then what you're going to do is you're simply going to choose more of the same. The reason I say that is that if we're going to solve the problem, we have to understand what the problem actually is. And sloganizing at the problem does not help. What you need to understand is what's the mechanism going under there. So if you walk into those boardrooms and say, you are a bunch of racist and sexist whatnots, you're not going to start a conversation. If you walk in there and say, what I'd like to think about is what we're valuing and how we value difference around the board and what relationship that has to assessment and mitigation of risk, what relationship that has to strategy and going into new markets or whatever. If you start that conversation, you've got a chance of saying the way to change this is to introduce difference. Now, you have to do other things as well. There's the pipeline. There's all sorts of influences on this. But my proposition to you is that the slogans don't help. What helps is understanding deficits locally, because they will be different in sector, in organisation, in different departments. There's a whole range of reasons for them. So get under the data that you've got and see where they are. And so what I'm saying to you is a little exercise when you go back. What are the reasons? What are the deficits in your organisation? What do you think might be the reasons? And if you don't know, how are you going to find out? What's the process you're going to go through to do a bit of burrowing, to look for that real detail underneath? So there's the myths. Okay, the first one is the blah, 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 and there's some examples of the blah, blah, blah. Those are statements taken from FTSE 100 websites, and they're all absolutely splendid, and I'm sure you've all got them. Well done you. Jolly good. You've got a blah, blah, blah. We aim to foster a culture of individuals of all backgrounds, blah, blah. We want a blah, blah. All those. Here's the thing. Now, the point about it is not to denigrate their statements. They mean it, they want it to happen, they want it to be so. Saying it doesn't make it happen. What you have to do is you have to find some way of linking this idea of diversity and the combination of difference to what you're actually trying to do. So you have to find some way of being specific. This is an example which I think is just particularly good. It was last year, as you can see from the Harvard Business Review, and what they did was they looked at companies' strategies, and broadly they divided them into two groups. The companies that followed merger and acquisition strategies, which is a high-risk, relatively short-term gain strategy, not necessarily short gain, but it's shorter than an investment in research and development and innovation, which is a lower risk, longer gain. And they used that and they asked themselves, what companies take those two things? And what they saw was in the research that if there was a better balance between men and women, firstly, firms shifted from that mergers and acquisition strategy to the research and development strategy. They became more open to change, and then this happened when women were valued. Now, what was interesting then was they went into looking at why they thought that was the case. And one of the things that came out of the research was really interesting. It was that as you go up organizations and become more senior, you start to calibrate risk differently from men. That's because most organizations, if a man tries something and it doesn't work, they go, well, he had a go. If a woman tries something and it doesn't work, they go, she can't do it. And so you start to calibrate risk very differently, because it's got a much higher jeopardy for you. So consequently, when you put those two, I'm not saying all men and all women are identical, I'm saying that as a group, culturally, that's how men and women tend to operate. So when they interact, you get a much better discussion of risk and assessment and so on and so forth. It's that kind of thing which I think gives us the ability to engage people in this idea about diversity and inclusion, because it's about seeing the difference, it's about valuing it, and using the combination in pursuit of this common aim. So I'm saying that there's a way of being specific. Second, being specific, this is BHP Billiton, the biggest mining company in the world. What they did was they set themselves this extraordinary aspirational goal, 50-50 by 2025. They won't get there. Only 70% of their staff were women when they made this. But why did they do it? That's what's interesting. They did it for basically two big reasons. Firstly, they looked at their staff and they realized, they just looked at the demography of their staff. Most of their staff are male, and a huge percentage of their staff are going to retire in the next 10 to 15 years. So they've got a huge numbers problem. And secondly, mining has changed enormously. AI, big data, robotics, or drones, all that stuff has fundamentally changed AI, as it has utilities. I mean, if you see a leak, if we do some work with utilities and sort of water companies, the way you mend leaks nowadays is you go into it with a robot or a drone or whatever, and it used to be some fat bloke digging a hole in the road, didn't it? And not necessarily fat, sometimes he was thin, but they were digging holes in the road, and they had their little thing round it, the T-bothy and so on and so forth. No, that's not how they do it any longer. Mining's the same, it's fundamentally changing, It's no longer one of those heavy industries where you have to wear a boiler suit and a hard hat and, heavy boots. You have to, if you want to see those, you have to go to clubs in Brighton on a Saturday night, where I live. I live in Brighton, naturally. We live in grade 1 listed house, actually, which is marvellous. That's just me. So numbers and skills. If we could attract more women, would that help us to broaden the skills base? Because they no longer wanted brawn, if you like. They wanted IT, project management, a whole bunch of stuff. So then they looked at bits of the business where there were more women, 20% and above, which, given the 17% figure that I told you about, is a significant number of women in BHP. And they discovered that there was a 47% reduction in injuries and a 17% increase in the accuracy of forecasting in those teams. And the reason was the teams operated differently because of a combination of men and women. Just examples. Those are particularly around sex and men and women, but they're examples of the way in which the combination of difference related to a business strategy with conscious use of difference actually gives you the kind of dividend that you might be looking for, but you have to be really accurate. So again, when you return, why don't you think in your team, in your business, in your department, think about those questions. Exactly what kind of, I'll give you one final example. It's an English department. An English department where we were asked to help diversify the staff. And I said to the person who ran the department, I said, why? I said, you know, what question are you trying to answer? You've got great students, great staff, great attainment, great research. It's all going gangbusters. What problem are you trying to solve? And she said, well, there is great English literature being written in the world by people who are not English. I want to represent that in the canon. That new canon of English literature in my staff. What she wanted was not ethnic diversity, she wanted cultural and geographic diversity. Very specific. She wanted people to bring a very specific sensibility into her staff. So it's that accuracy that really gives you the hook to engage everybody, because everybody should be and can be engaged in the business strategy. Number 2, avoiding the jargon jungle. We've seen some of it today. I'm sorry if you feel this is critical, but I just think we're removing diversity from the... People don't speak like this. People don't say, oh dear, I had a microaggression today. People don't say, she's intersectional. They say, do you know that gay woman who comes from the north? We don't speak like this. And the trouble with speaking like this, it does 2 things. One is when people use jargon, they feel damn good about themselves. It really makes people feel jolly important, as if they know something that no one else knows. And if we're really going to involve everybody in this thing called diversity inclusion, we need to start speaking plainly. Secondly, the problem with the acronyms, LGBTQIA+, no. It's meaningless nonsense. It doesn't describe a coherent group of people at all, apart from which it has also taken one of my great passions in life, which is lesbian and gay equality, and turned it into a slightly secure password on the internet. But it doesn't mean anything. Seriously, lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, okay, well that's fine, but lesbian, gay and bisexual, wholly different set of needs and demands from people who are trans. It's a totally different area. One is about gender identity and so on. One is about sexual orientation. Totally different. Q, well, hello. I won't say the word, but the Great African American Museum of History in Washington, would we really call that the N-word museum? Would you really use that word? Well, don't use that word about me, because it was the word they used when they kicked me and broke my rib. It's a meaningless word. What does it mean? You dye your hair pink and look a bit special. Seriously, I've had it up to... I used to be really nice about this before. I've had it now. Now, the point is, if people want to use it, that's one thing. But it's the generalization as if this is the way in which we now talk about these things, which is deeply excluding of a whole group of people who don't want to talk about things like that. So when we talk about the lesbian and gay community or whatever, well, you have to recognize actually there's a very different set of attitudes to that acronym across that so-called community. And at the moment, it's very, very divided. So you have to find some way of not using the jargon. And the other one, which is a particular bugbear, stop using peace at the end of things. The consumer piece. No, they're consumers. They're your customers. It doesn't add anything except a word. But I make the most important point, though, is this idea that if you use this language, that's, as somebody very sensibly said at the beginning, lovely, sorry, I can't remember your name from East Midlands Railway, who said at the beginning, people do kind of roll their eyes sometimes, and when diversity is mentioned, and this is one of the reasons, is they just don't feel it's part of their life. And we've got to make it feel part of our lives, and we've got to talk plainly and talk about what it really means. And here's a very good example. The word privilege was used earlier, and it's used a lot these days. This is what I would make this is the critique I'd make of it. Firstly, it's inherited from America, like too many things at the moment are inherited from America. It's like we really only discovered racism when George Floyd was murdered. Is that seriously what we're doing these days? We're inheriting things, we're importing things from the States that have a different significance. They fall differently. So when you say privilege in the UK, people think Eton, Tufts, Ascot, money, parties, that's what they think of. That's what privilege means to most people. Pop out in the street and ask them, what does privilege mean? It means public schools. It means that kind of thing. And the problem with it is that it's trying to get at something, an idea, which is that certain people, that there are power relations between people. And I have a friend, a very good colleague and friend, who is a very senior pediatric consultant. She's very well known nationally, and she works in a hospital. And she's Ghanaian British. And she and I have had long conversations because she doesn't like the word, because she understands, both of us understand, what it's trying to get at. But actually, she says, look, my problem is that I'm incredibly privileged in the organisation I work in. She said, I can get anything done. She said, I'm a senior consultant. I'm the most senior consultant at the hospital. But so what we've ended up with, and it's her phrase actually, is this idea of the constant hindrance that you experience being black or brown. Now, that is something that's very specific to all people who are not white. If you like, you experience the gaze of the white people the whole time. That's what you experience, as it's been explained to me. So I watch it with Adam, my husband. I see him experience racism. But the experience he has of race is very, very different than lots of other people who are also, as Adam said, colour. So what I'm saying to you is that I think we have to be careful with this word privilege, because it's not embracing in this common effort that we're trying to create. And I put up these figures because if you look, so the ONS, Office of National Statistics, does this attainment 8 scores. And you can see what's going on there. So you've got, the thing that's most shocking actually about this slide is that the average score in England is 46.7 out of 90. I mean, our schools are not great, are they? Anyway, that's not my point. My point is, if you look at the first set of figures, that's the average across, and these are not my categories, these are the Office of National Statistics ethnic categories. So this is the census categories, okay? So those are the scores across the census categories. But look at the poverty penalty. So what I've done there is I've taken, because they also disaggregate it by kids on free school meals, so you can compare the Chinese average on free school meals and the Chinese average not on free school meals. And that's what I've called the poverty penalty. But look what it is. For white kids, it's over twice what it is for black kids. My only point is not to say that racism doesn't exist. Of course racism exists, and we need to tackle it and we need to commit to it. The point I'm making here is that if you say to poor white people, you have privilege, it doesn't land. Why would they hear that when actually the dominant characteristic of their life is poverty? So what I'm saying is it doesn't help us to understand the relationship. The other thing that I think is problematic with it personally is that I think it suggests that there's a relationship between black and white people that is immovable. And, again, my husband and I talk about this a lot. It's like, does that mean that I'm always the oppressor and you're always the victim? Well, no, actually. Relationships of power are very dynamic. So I'm just using that as an example. We're using these things, they're tripping off our tongues, and we're using them, and actually what it's doing is it's stopping us thinking about what we really need to think about to make this stuff successful. Allies is another one. I mean, the whole idea. I mean, allies, the point about difference is that everybody's got it and everybody can bring it. And what you need to do is combine your difference with other people's difference. And whenever people talk about straight allies, I always feel like I'm being wheeled around in a hospital by a slightly powerful and nice heterosexual, being helped out. And I don't want to be helped out. I want to have solidarity with somebody where we've got a common aim and we're both committed to it, but we understand we've got difference. So again, and the thing about allies is it bathes people in virtue. The classic one is flexible working. What happens is that in flexible working, women, most of you in the room, take more advantage of flexible working than men do. And what happens is that disadvantages you in your careers, because people think, oh, she took time off, she's not committed to all that stuff. What the men do is the men go, oh, I think it's really important that women have flexible working. Well, if you think it's really important that women have flexible working, why don't you look after your own kids? Do you know what I mean? I mean, but what you do is you get reflected glory out of being an ally, is my point. And I think it's a really worrying word. You don't need to be an ally of somebody. You need to understand your difference, you understand theirs, and we need to combine it. I'm in a very polemical mood today, aren't I? My goodness me. Aren't I just banging a bloody table? We should be at Speaker's Corner. Inclusion, here's a real problem. And it was interesting listening to the panel, because what we all think inclusion is about is including all voices. Yes? That's what we need to do. We need to include all voices. Now, I have a friend who is the head of Saatchi's, and she's very unusual because she's a woman, and she's black, and she's in her 40s. She's unusual in the sense that there are very few women who are black in their 40s, the head of big companies in British industry. So she's, pretty unusual. And we had a panel we were doing once, and we choreographed a little exchange. And the exchange was, do you think inclusion, Sarah, means including all voices? Yes, she does. Yes, I do, she said. I said, even a racist voice? She goes, absolutely not. And I said, I agree with you. I said, next question, who decides what's racist? Who decides what's sexist? Who decides what's homophobic, transphobic, whatever? Who makes that decision? And the problem at the moment is those words are being weaponized rather than used as a way of investigating and understanding disadvantage, and they're not used as the beginning of a conversation or a dialogue. They are being used in order to separate people. And so inclusion, what's happening is that it's now taking on a peculiar definition, which is almost the opposite of it, which is you have to speak like this to be inclusive, behave like this and think like this, and if you don't, we'll exclude you. So the real challenge for us, and this, by the way, I do an session called The Inclusive Leader, and I got a wonderful email from a colleague after it who'd been on the session. She said, before we started the session, I thought this was where all the pink and fluffy stuff was, she said. And at the end of it, she said, I realized it's where all the muck and bullets are. This is human relationships. Conflict is a given. We are going to find, and that lovely phrase that I think was the feedback from the East Midlands Railway staff was we need to spend more time not being offended and not causing offence. So we really need to work on how we do that, because offence is being weaponized. It's enough to say, I am offended by that, to shut the conversation down. That should open the conversation up, not shut it down. Now, I'm not saying that we don't challenge racism and we don't challenge, of course we do. But the question is, what are we doing it for? What do we want to come out of that experience, And as long as we weaponize it in that sort of way, and so there's a lot of talk about this idea of safe spaces. I commend another book to you. This is the second best book that I'm going to recommend to you. She's absolutely fantastic, Amy. She's a professor at Harvard, and this book, The Fearless Organization, is terrific, and it's really readable. Psychological safety it's not speaking up as if it was sticking your head above the parapet. Speaking up is assumed. Contributing is assumed. Disagreeing is rewarded. Now, there are lots of ways in which we can say this is how we're going to disagree with each other. So we can make some rules about you don't shout, you don't swear. We can make rules about all sorts of things like that. But actually, the idea that we disagree with each other has got to be, it's a fundamental human thing. Going back to that idea, you can't see the world through anyone else's eyes, so you can't see a situation through their eyes. So listening and curiosity is fundamental. So, interesting example she starts the book with. When she started investigating psychological safety, they did a bunch of data on medical teams, surgical teams, and whether or not there was a correlation between psychological safety and the committing of medical errors. And they discovered after this vast data set that there was. But it was the exact opposite of what they thought it was going to be. The correlation was that psychologically safe surgical teams made more errors. And they thought, this is bizarre. And they worried and worried and worried about this data set for about 3 months. And then Amy had a bit of a moment, and she thought, I think I understand it now. And they asked a couple of supplementary questions, then they realized what the correlation said, what the data was actually telling them. What the data was actually telling them was that psychologically safe teams don't make more mistakes, they report more mistakes. And that's how they learn. Whereas the psychologically unsafe teams were keeping it all to themselves and weren't learning. So from that, she developed this idea. And I guess my phrase is this idea of is spaces that are safe for disagreement, not from disagreement. Safety is being misused as an idea at the moment. Safe is the idea that I won't be offended. No, safe is where you can be offended and we understand and are prepared and willing and able to deal with the fact that we were offended, upset, hurt, put off, excluded, whatever it was. And one last thought about this is that one of the most difficult elements of this is when, as managers, you intervene in this stuff. And this is particularly true, I think, for HR. Because often, I used to think that the thing you need to do is intervene immediately. But the more I listen to people's stories, the more I realize that isn't necessarily the case. Often people don't want you to intervene immediately because actually that can really raise the social temperature. It can be really quite difficult and make everything quite awkward. But the one thing that people want you to know is that you will intervene, that you will have their back, that you will hear it, you will see it, and you'll say to them afterwards, what was that? How was it? Are you okay? And now what shall we do about it? So 2 things, back to the subjective and the collective. First of all, we all need to listen to hear, not listen to respond. That's the first part of the process. The second part of the process is now what we're going to do about it. And we somehow have to, and managers, this is the most difficult thing I think that managers need to do. And I have one suggestion, but if you look at the way in which people are being excluded, I just put these examples up because they've happened in academia, but we can bung the slides around, can't we? So these are 2 professors, both of whom were asked to speak on subjects on which they're national and international experts, but the students decided there were going to be no platform for their views about something else. So I just use that as 2 recent examples. We'll bung them round, but this has happened at Essex University. And I think this is a rather wonderful response to that kind of thing, because a lot of this is coming from academia, and I love this. This is the part of the introduction by this guy, John Ellison, who's the University of Chicago, to the first-year students. And this is what he's saying to them. This is the letter he writes to them before they get there. And it's that last bit. You will find that we expect members of our community to be engaged in rigorous debate, discussion, and even disagreement. At times, this may challenge you and even cause discomfort. So somehow, what we're going to have to do is say to people, actually, there is a statement of view about something, X, Y, or Z, and you may not like that. You may find that disagreeable. But actually, what we have to entertain is the conversation between. And at the moment, there are 2 big flashpoints on this. One is around race. I mean, the Black Lives Matter campaign is one thing in its generality, but in specific terms, the Black Lives Matter campaign argues that all disparities between white and black are just a result of race. That is, broadly speaking, their approach. Now, that's fine. You can argue that. There's a brilliant piece of work by Ta-Nehisi Coates in The New Yorker on the case for reparations. It's a wonderful article. It's absolutely, I commend it to you. Happen to disagree with some of it, but I commend it to you because it's brilliant and it's brilliantly argued. He would argue that kind of argument, but there's a whole bunch of other voices, black and brown voices, that don't argue that and don't think that. So inclusion means understanding both of those. And the other one is obviously around the whole question of trans rights and women's rights. There are a group of people supported by the law who are broadly known as gender critical, who believe that biology is immutable. I'm one of them. I don't think you can actually change sex. What the law allows you to do is exercise a legal fiction to be treated for legal purposes as if you have changed sex. Now, that's an important thing to allow those people to live as they want to live. But there's another group of people who, broadly speaking, are called gender ideologists, who do believe that you can actually change sex and that trans women are women. Now, whatever view you take in that, and that's not my point is that those 2 views, A, exist, B, are arguable, and C, are defended and established by the law as defended beliefs under the Equality Act. So as HR people and as managers, we need somehow to empower people in our organisations either to have that discussion or to respect each other and not have the discussion, but respect that actually those views are different. It is no good each side of those views standing in the opposite sides of the corner and shouting bigot at each other, because it's very damaging for our organisations. And actually, it was interesting. I'd be lovely to talk to you afterwards, but I mean, the NHS has done some heinous things in this respect of late. I mean, particularly denying that there was a man in the room when a patient was raped. And that's because the rapist was a trans woman. Now, that's just a terrible confusion, which comes from, I think, oddly, a kind of good place, a sort of be kind, let's not offend anybody. Well, no, I'm sorry, that's going to take us into a terrible place if we can't be clear with each other about our differences and our distinctions. So I just, it seems to me it's really quite frightening. And let's bring your whole self to work. No, don't. God forbid that I brought my whole self. I mean, you're seeing enough of me now, but what if I brought the whole of me? I mean, dear Jesus. I think the problem is it's the emphasis on the wrong word in a sentence. It's not bring your whole self to work. It's bring your whole self to work. Work has parameters and rules, and as I say, a common purpose. So what bring your whole self to work means is what can you bring through your story and your understanding and your background to the common achievement with your colleagues of what we're trying to do. And part of the other problem is this whole self idea. Again, it's a very subjective notion based on identity, and it kind of means that you should behave, I've got to behave as I've got to be me at work, which means you have somehow got to conform to what it is I want you to be and do and think. Well, that can't be a way to live. I mean, you can't have a relationship with anybody like that, can you? If you just insist that they believe what you, and what they have to do is validate you the whole time, your opinions, yourself, your identity. So what I'm saying is that this is, again, it's about work, it's about organizations, it's about collaborating through difference. And these are difficult things, but I think we need some courage now, because I think it'll help us in the long term to really embrace our differences and therefore understand more, as much as we can, about each other. This is quite a useful, it's a very useful way of trying to enter that conversation. Kenji Yoshino, you can see who he is. He wrote a pamphlet called Uncovering Talent with Deloitte, and covering is an interesting idea. Covering is not about being in the closet. Covering is the bits of you that you mute because you feel that there will be an organizational penalty. So the classic, he's got these 4 axes. So the appearance one, the classic, for instance, I don't know whether any black women in the room have experienced this particularly, but an afro, growing your hair out into an afro, I don't know whether you've ever done that, but that is not seen as business wear somehow. So, black women don't, because they feel that they'll be penalised for so doing. Wearing a scarf, a veil of any kind. These kind of things. I know gay men who dress down. I've come dressed as the set. Isn't that embarrassing? And also, this looks like the drawing room of a footballer's wife's pool house. The white sofas, dear God. I was going to wear a white suit, actually, then I would have just faded to the background. But, so appearance is one thing. It's how you conform. It's what the organisation asks of you, but in an inexplicit way, in a covert way. Affiliation, that would be the arguments you might take up. So if you see something in the newspaper, the classic one in universities, no one ever says they're a Brexiteer or voted Conservative. Academics just would not do that. They'd be isolated. Advocacy, that's the thing when you're in the room and you're the person who puts the hand up saying, actually, that's sexist. You're the woman who always has to do that. And you think, oh, God, the organisation will label me. And association is who you hang around with. Now, what's useful about this, I think, is that if you ask people whether they feel, your direct reports, for instance, ask people whether they feel they have to mute certain things about themselves, whether there are things they won't say. Now, I understand there's a contradiction in this, because if you say to people, are you covering, and they are covering, they're going to say no, because they're covering. So I understand that. So you have to go in slightly obliquely about this, but it's the idea. What you're trying to discover here is what are the underlying, the unwritten rules in your organisation to which people are feeling they have to conform without anybody actually saying that they've got to conform. And I'll tell you, if you have these conversations with your teams and so on and so forth, you will find really interesting things about your team or your department or the organisation. What is it that people are just feeling they kind of have to conform to? So I just commend it to you. He's terrific, Kenji. I could tell you more about him. He wrote a book called Covering. It's that's my third best book I'm going to recommend to you. This is training. Look, we all spend, as somebody said before, billions of pounds on training. And one of the problems is that actually, this huge thing where, for instance, unconscious bias, Unconscious bias training. Let's get unconscious bias training. That's what we'll do. We'll get that in. And my suggestion to you is that biases are not unconscious. Two things. One is the implicit association test. Have you ever taken the implicit association test? You know, the thing we get words and pictures, and it's the speed with which you associate one with the other is supposed to tell you whether you're a racist or not. And so methodologically, there's a huge argument about the fact there's a cutout point, does speed really do it? But crucially, does taking the test actually tell you about how you behave? It might tell you about some of the underlying attitudes, but does it, and the answer is even the people who invented it now are saying, no, it doesn't tell you anything about how you behave. I took the implicit association test, and it told me I still had a slight preference for heterosexual men, which is a phase I thought I'd got over some time ago. But unconscious bias, I think, is dangerous. And the reason I think it's dangerous is this, is that not only does the training actually not necessarily change people's behaviours, we'll get onto that, but the worst thing about it is that when you tell people that all biases are unconscious, the reaction is, oh, phew. So it's everybody, is it? So I don't have to do anything about it because biases are just around. And what you find is that the more that, so the more you find that you normalize the idea that bias is universal and everywhere and pervasive, the more people start to conform to it and the less responsibility they start to challenge it. And the two academics that I mentioned down there, Michelle Duguid and Melissa Thomas Hunt, have done extensive research on this, and actually it's really rather worrying. Whereas the more we talk about bias, the more people conform to those biases. And my point would be that actually, if we tell people they're unconscious, they think they have no control over them, but we've learnt them. So if we've learnt them, then we should make some effort to unlearn them. Now, you can't unlearn them by unthinking. We didn't learn them rationally, so we can't unlearn them rationally. And the one example I always give is standing by the bus stop, again with my lovely husband. He gets mentioned rather a lot these days, but he's terribly nice. But you'd expect to be, wouldn't you? He's my husband. I don't mean that because of me. I mean, why would you marry somebody you don't like? Although people do. Why do they marry people they don't like? It is extraordinary, isn't it? Oh, I hate my wife. Well, why did you? Beats me. Anyway, so I'm going down a little sideway. Down the motorway, suddenly went up a slip road there, the B493. So what was I talking about? So, standing by the bus stop, and this car went by, and it was a black guy in a convertible car, rather smart, and I thought, oh, I wonder who he is. And then a few minutes later, a white guy went by in another smart convertible, and I thought, oh, nice car. And I realised that, that's years and years and years of having black guys in smart cars being characterised in a very particular way. And I thought, hello, that's interesting. And one of the things I find, I don't know whether you find this, but the more I work in diversity, the more I spend day after day after day asking and listening and thinking and talking about this stuff, the more I am aware of the thoughts that I have learnt, the more I find the most extraordinary racist and sexist things going through my mind, like some bizarre current of electricity. It's really odd. And I think it's just because you've become more aware of them, because you're sensitive to the assumptions you might or might not be making. But I really do think that you can challenge these things by wanting to and then taking some action. And the big thing I would say is that it isn't behaviour, it's thinking doesn't change behaviour. One of the reasons that training doesn't work to change behaviour in a fundamental way is its behaviour changes thinking. We have to put ourselves in a different position. So the more we are in position with white people, with black people, the more we change our views of each other. The more that men work with women who are present in the room and making those demands, the more we change. And so it goes on. So there's much to be learned, I think, from contact theory and not so much to be learned from just simple training. And I think online training is actually, in a sense, when it's not experiential, one does begin to worry about the validity of it if you really want to change people's behaviours. Number 5, this is the last of the myths, and then I'll give you a couple of practical things, and then we can all go and have a drink. Number 5, staff networks. Everybody's got staff networks. I mean, they are the go-to, aren't they, of the HR, the smart HR director. And they're wonderful in many, many ways. But they can become what I call grumble hubs. And the way they become grumble hubs is when they face inwards. So they become this idea that here we are, the LGBT, blah, 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 the BAME, the whatever it is. So there they are. Firstly, those groups of people don't have a single voice. When CEOs say to me, oh, we need to get more women, I always say to them, let's pop out in the high street and get 6 assorted then. And they go, I don't mean that. And I go, I know you don't mean that. But don't talk about women as if they're somehow all the same and you just kind of need half a dozen of them and that'll solve the problem. Those groups do not speak with a single voice. They are individuals, they have different family backgrounds, cultural backgrounds, political opinions, a whole bunch of stuff. So you really do have to listen hard to those groups and not enable gatekeepers within them, because gatekeepers will set themselves up within those groups. And in the most damaging groups, and it's certainly happening in some LGBT blah, blah, blah groups, is that certain people with certain opinions are literally being excluded from them. They're being told they're not the right kind of gay or whatever, which is, this is not a good thing. So I'm suggesting that is the first thing. But the second thing is just three thoughts about how you ask them to sort of set out and support them to set out what they're in business to do. The first is, can they bring different voices to the creation and implementation of the strategy of the company, the department, whatever? So can they be actively involved in the creation of products, of innovation, of forward-looking, and add something you haven't got? So using them, if you like, as a critical friend for the executive of the board or whoever it is. So facing outwards to the company. Secondly, is an absolutely valid reason, a purpose, I think, in supporting each other. Women talk to women about the negotiation around men in business, and that's a very useful thing to do. Gay people will get solidarity out of talking to each other and just, if something crap happens, it's nice to, there's all that sort of stuff, and it's very, very valuable as long as it's seen as a way of advancing career. And there was one law firm that I knew, and the gay group, it just made me laugh this, the gay group used the budget they'd been given by this top Magic Circle law firm to go to a Beyonce concert. And you just thought, that's so funny. They are so just taking the piss out of the senior people's liberalism. Because you can see all the people, the top people go, oh, yeah, well, we better let them go. Otherwise we'll be accused of being homophobic or something. And it just made me roar with laughter. I thought they're taking the piss. Anyway, but there is a real value in that. They're not social clubs. They're not social clubs. They're career progression clubs. And the third thing, I always say this to people, get them to have events that are not about them. And I first tumbled to this in Rolls-Royce, which I love Rolls-Royce. We did some work there. I mean, it's very 1970s. It's fantastic. To be in the LGBT group in the Rolls-Royce, you don't have to be gay. So fantastic. You don't have to come out because, it's kind of difficult because it's a very old-fashioned atmosphere. So I said to them, why don't you run an event about, I don't know, the marginal difference in the relationship between fuel and engine capacity, whatever. That's what they think about all day. Run an event about that, but make sure the panel is people from your network. But don't mention the network, just host it. Because what it does is it puts that network into the middle of the company. So instead of it being over there as the minority thing, you're contributing to actually what people like to think about. Is it product development? Whatever it is, So that's just 3 hints about a way in which you might set them up. Putting it into practice, I use that little mantra, see difference, value it and combine it. If we can support managers to do that, to recognize that difference feels scary. Managers always say, managing diversity is more difficult than managing, people who are the same. Well, that's only true if you think all people are the same. Managing well is always about managing difference. Everybody's motivated differently. Everybody has a different thing that they bring to work. So in a sense, it's good management to see difference, value it, and combine it, but it's damn hard. I admire good managers beyond belief. I think they're extraordinary in their ability to motivate people. I've mentioned this before, but again, the stories. Set store by stories. In your teams, have people, I do a little exercise at the beginning of workshops when I do it, and I get people in pairs to talk to each other and find differences in their backgrounds and their upbringings and their families and their history. Just differences. Once they get to similarities, no, skip over that. Because when you go to a party and you meet somebody and you come back and they go, your friend says, I met this person at a party, we had so much in common. And I think, how dull. Do you know what I mean? I mean, I'm interested in stuff I don't know. I'm not interested in stuff I already know. I can bore people about that for hours. You know, so use stories. Get people to tell each other their stories the whole time and find these differences, because it will actually change and it will enable you to work together in a much better way. And you don't have to pull your cut out. Somebody I did a thing with once, we were in a session, and this person said, I don't like sharing personal details at work. I really like to keep a separation between work and home, and I'd just like to say that, if that's okay. Fantastic. You know tons about how to work with that person now. You know where their boundaries are. Interestingly, as the day went by, everybody respected their boundaries, and their boundaries started to shift. So by the end of the day, they'd opened up. That was because people respected how they told their story in the first place. I use this as a recruitment. We've invented a recruiting method called Recruiting for Difference, which de-biases recruitment. But I use this because when you start putting people together, so what people do typically in recruitment is you get the old job description down, and you have a little look at the job description, you have a bit of a fiddle with it, and then you talk to HR, and then eventually you advertise it because, you know, Fred's leaving and you want another Fred or Frederica or whatever. But actually, the problem with job descriptions is the one thing they don't do is describe the job. They're always about 19 pages long. You've all waded through them. You know, they're result of... You know, no one ever takes anything out of a job description, do they? So if you look carefully down it, you know, everybody's got to kind of cook, you know, creme brulee at 4 in the afternoon. You know what I mean? There are all these things in there that bear no relation to the job. So my point is to say, take people around this circle and use this as a way of essentially saying, what are the things we really need to do right now? So what are our immediate 2, 3, 4 year priorities? What are we doing in this team, in this department? So let's think about what kind of combination, talent strategy would help us to do it better. So let's think about the team that we've got. Who have we got? So who do we want to add? So I use this, I mean, I gave it a posh name, calling it the virtuous circle of selection. That's because people like a name. But it's a very simple way of but it gives you that moment to think about your team. And what you then do is, as we say, put the curtain in, because the famous story about the orchestras, you know, when they were recruiting for new musicians, they put the curtain in, women took off their high heels, you couldn't see who was playing, you could only hear who was playing, so what you did was you recruited on the basis of their evidence of how they played. You didn't recruit them, because what was happening was they kept on recruiting blokes, and they couldn't understand why they kept on recruiting blokes, and they said they didn't just want to recruit blokes. So you put the curtain in. And what you do with this idea, but what lies underneath this idea, is that when you think about what's the combination of difference we need, who have we got, so who do we want, who can bring to the work what we haven't got? Is that the perspective, the background? It's not just about professional experience and professional skills. It's about a whole range of other things that they might bring. So what this process helps you to do, I think, is to re-evaluate what it is you really want people to bring in particular jobs. Because that whole thing of standard competencies, you don't want everybody to bring the same thing. You want people to bring different things. So what I'm suggesting here is what we do is we go through this process, kind of diagnostic, and then we get people to identify the criteria that describes the job now in this team in context of their strategy at this moment. And it's just that pause that you get just to think, what do we need and what are we valuing in the people we're bringing in? And the key thing is that what you then do is you assess against those criteria. You don't use CVs, and the reason we don't use CVs, you might look at them, HR might want to check on them, but in the hiring process, CVs are hopeless. And the reason they're hopeless is that they're shaped in a very particular way, and we pick out of them what we want. Whereas if you've gone through a process saying, this is what we're looking for you to bring, the candidate knows exactly what you're looking for, so that's great, they can bring their experience. And secondly, you know what you're judging them on. So you're trying to create a framework agreed between the recruiters as to what it is you really want. And then what you do, and this is invented by somebody called Iris Bonet, who's another professor at Harvard, is what you then do, and this is why you put the curtain in, is instead of looking at the evidence that the candidates provide on the criteria, candidate by candidate, you look at all the answers to criteria 1 and all the answers to criteria 2. The reason I show you this is one simple reason. Behavior changes thinking. We are very ingrained in our biases and our thinking. So therefore, we find it very difficult to shake them off. So what we have to do is redesign processes to give us the opportunity, in this case, really to look at the evidence and really identify the criteria we really are looking for. Because otherwise what happens, as you know, in recruitment processes, the most powerful person in the room goes, oh, I just think he'll hit the ground running, fit in better, be part of the culture, plays golf, I like the look of his, blah, blah, blah. It's those things at the end. So if you tie people into this framework and really think about what we're valuing, and then give yourselves the opportunity really to assess whether the people are bringing what you wanted, that helps us. Now, this is true of all processes, is that the more we give ourselves the opportunity to redesign processes so we can really look at the evidence or really look at what people are bringing, the more we will give ourselves the opportunity to make better decisions. That's me. Want to talk more? That's it. You won't have listened to anything I say, well, I'm sure you've written it down and taken slides and so on and so forth. But just by way of jolliness, let me tell you a story at the end, which is really about difference. And it's about four fathers in a bar. And they're talking to each other. One of them goes to the loo, and the other three start talking about their sons. And the first one says, well, my son's a fantastic bloke. He said he's got... He started as a builder, and then he bought that little company, and then he bought another set of companies. He now owns the biggest provider of luxury apartments in London. He's a multi-millionaire. He's incredibly generous. He's very, very popular. And the second one says, it's nothing. He said, my son, he said, started as a mechanic, bought a garage, bought a series of garages. He now runs the biggest organisation that provides luxury limousines in London, multi-millionaire, very popular, very generous. The third one says, well, my son started off as an air steward, bought the plane, bought a series of planes. He's now the biggest provider of luxury jets in the southeast. He's a multi-millionaire, he's very popular, and he's very jealous. And the fourth dad comes back from the loo and he says, you lot are looking very smug. What are you talking about? And they say, we're talking about our sons and how brilliant they are. And he says, really? And they say, yeah, what does your son do? And he says, my son is a stripper in a gay bar. And they say, oh, that's so sad. I'm so sorry about that. And he says, no, not at all. I have a fantastic relationship with him. He's an absolutely terrific bloke. And for his last birthday, his best friend gave him a luxury apartment, a Learjet, and a Mercedes limousine by all of his four boyfriends. So the point is, never judge somebody when the first you see them. Judge them after you know about them. Thanks very much for listening. Cheers.